I'm Kyri Evagora. I'm a partner and a solicitor at Reed Smith. This week is London Shipping Week, a week in which business representatives involved in the shipping industry convene for over 200 meetings, seminars and functions in London. As part of our modest contribution, we're going to be hearing from one of the world's leading names in maritime and merchant shipping security. A former soldier specialising in intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance, he served Britain in Northern Ireland and in Iraq. He's well known for his extraordinary expertise in maritime security issues and has spent the past decade of his career fighting the unique security risks and piracy challenges which affect many of our clients in the shipping and commodities trading industries. His name is Mr Wylie. Jordan, welcome to Reed Smith. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Are cargo and vessel attacks still a major issue for the shipping and commodities industry in maritime and international trade?
Yeah, for me personally, in my experience and what I see day to day, it's still a huge issue. I think we often look at the Somali-based piracy because that was the flavour of the month for many years, and although that has been contained, there are still other hotspots in the world that piracy, criminality and terrorism is a huge problem for the maritime security or the maritime domain. I think if we look at West Africa, for example, we've seen more incidents there over the last 2 years than we've probably ever seen before. But on the east coast of Africa, certainly the three pillars of security that have not eradicated, but certainly contained Somali piracy. We saw incredible naval operations and investment in the region with EU NAVFOR, with the US coalition-led military forces there. We saw best management practices, industry basically educating itself on what to do in the event of transit in a high-risk area. And we also saw the use of privately contracted armed guards like myself, which some might say became a victim of their own success because no vessel was ever hijacked with an armed security team on board, still to this day.
So you've seen quite significant changes and improvements evolve in maritime security over the last decade?
Yeah, certainly where counter-piracy or anti-piracy, as we often refer to it, is concerned. When I left the military in 2009, dare I say, it was a very unregulated sector. You know, I literally left the military front door and I jumped on a ship having never been on a vessel in my life. I didn't have any qualifications. I'd never been on a boat before. You know, these people are incredible. They speak a different language. I didn't know my port from my starboard 10 years ago. But yeah, I was expected to be responsible as a team leader to protect these incredible, magnificent machines that are carrying the world's cargo around the oceans. That has come a long way since then. Now, you know, you need lots of qualifications. There are lots of hoops to jump through. You need experience. You need to go on lots of training courses. You need to make sure that you understand what to do in an emergency on board. You know, you need to be familiar with the life rafts, you know, all the emergency procedures. You need to make sure that you can fire the weapon system that you're going to be using. You need to have criminal background checks. A lot of selection and vetting goes on before a security operative gets on board a ship, but it certainly wasn't the case in 2009 when I first entered the industry.
Leaving aside some of the sort of state-sponsored activity that we are witnessing today, I mean, what are the current piracy hotspots as far as you are aware in terms of challenge and how's the industry adapting in those new emerging hotspots?
Yeah, I think the three major hotspots still, as they have been probably for the last decade and maybe beyond, are the west side of the Indian Ocean or the Somali-based piracy as we know it. We've got the Gulf of Guinea and the water surrounding the Nigeria area, and then we've got the South China Seas and the Malacca Straits, and they're all very different types of piracy in some respects. The Somali piracy was always the kidnap and ransom model. Essentially, the pirates would hijack a vessel and they would ransom for a fee the crew, the cargo, and the vessel itself. And that was often a business transaction, and if all went to plan, normally, not always, people would not get harmed or hurt, although it wasn't always the case. And then on the west side of Africa, which is still very current and very vibrant, is this petrol piracy, where refined oil is being stolen almost on a daily basis. I think in the last 6 months we've seen more than 50 attacks or attempted attacks of piracy in this area alone, which is incredible. And the shift and the focus, I guess, from the world's media has gone to the opposite side of the continent.
And is the focus there the underlying cargo itself, or are those also attacks which are essentially designed to generate revenue and ransoms from ship owners or cargo owners?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a combination of different factors on the west side of Africa. But I think what is important to remember in all this is that problems at sea normally, and in most cases, stem from problems and challenges on land. And when we look at the levels of corruption, the lack of opportunity for people, we're working with some very complex countries here. The Somali pirate model, as I said, we look at Somalia as a case study, and this is an area that has been at civil war for 20, 30 years. It's still trying to stabilise its own government now with the federal government of Somalia. Most people are lacking in opportunity. Look at education and things for the next generation. It doesn't look that bright for me personally when I go and visit these countries, which is why I always try and tell a balanced story when I look at piracy. It's not a case of we're the good guys because we're protecting the ships and these are the bad guys. In fact, it's far from that, in my opinion. We have to put ourselves in their shoes and not forget to take our own shoes off when we look at piracy.
So, Jordan, I know that you're no stranger to partnering with lawyers such as ourselves or insurers and business executives in relation to strategies and tactics on security. I also know that you are the author of a book called The Citadel, a #1 bestseller, which I've had the benefit of reading, where you describe in some considerable detail some of the quite harrowing experiences that you had in the line of duty, protecting crew, protecting ships. Can you share with us a couple of examples of the big events that happened to you during that period?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I said earlier, it was a new career journey for me the moment I left the military. And the military and the private sector, when it comes to security, are very different. When you serve in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, you normally, with lots of people, you've normally got some incredible leaders, you've got a lot of support, and if anything goes wrong, normally within 60 minutes, a helicopter or a tank or something's going to be there to support you. Whereas, contrary to that, in the private sector, it's quite a lonely place, especially at sea. I used to say to soldiers who, as a soldier, you often think, well, I've seen most of the world and I've done most things out there, but I can assure you that there's no more place more remote on the planet than being in the middle of the Indian Ocean when you're perhaps a week away from, the nearest port or whatever it might be. And for me, I find seafarers incredible people because, to work at sea 9-10 months a year, some of these crews, this is their first home, it's not their second home. So their characters, their resilience is really special, and I was very privileged to work alongside these people who are transporting 90% plus still of global trade around the world. I always find it it's almost a thankless task. We just take for granted that we have our phones, our food, our clothes, the things we have in our homes. We don't realise that people are working 24/7 to make sure our goods get there. And the only time we do realise that is when it's been affected by the so-called bad guys, when they've disrupted it, when they've hijacked a ship that's got, that LNG or gas, oil, whatever it might be on it, and then how it affects what's going on back home. But I did about 150 missions across the Indian Ocean in the height of piracy between 2009 to 2012. That was a time where Somali piracy was at its height. At one point, we had nearly 1,000 crewmen taken hostage at one time, in captivity. We had more than 30 vessels, cargo ships in Somali ports being held for ransom. So this was a multi-billion-dollar business at the time for lots of different stakeholders. As I said, I jumped on a ship in the early days, I guess, and I built up that experience, the hard way in some respects, because a lot of the weapons that I came across I'd never used, never seen before. I was working in mixed nationality crews where perhaps English wasn't their first language, and certainly Russian or Indian was not mine. So it was really challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. As I say, these are special people. But I think, we look at the pirate attacks that took place. I was involved in several incidents. More often than not, you would fire a couple of warning shots or flares, and the pirates would move away and wait for another vessel because there was, excuse the pun, plenty more fish in the sea or plenty more vessels in the sea. And only probably at that time, only about 20-25% of vessels were carrying armed security teams. So, only 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 were carrying armed teams during the height, and that grew quite rapidly. But I guess that the book itself was based on this particular story where I took a vessel from the Middle East into Somali port of Mogadishu. Mogadishu is renowned for being one of the most dangerous cities in the world, I guess due to its lack of law at the time when I was there. It was still recovering from a civil war. It was still trying to stabilise as a nation. And we were supposed to discharge our cargo, which was part of the World Food Programme. We were delivering rice, grains, to the people of Somalia as part of international aid. And as you guys will know better than me, depending on the flag of the vessel, depends on what laws are applicable to that vessel, and certain vessels do not still today allow the carriage of armed security on board. So in that scenario, the ship owner may decide, well, we still want an unarmed security team, which meant they would bring in people like myself to advise on contingency planning, and we do things like implement best management practices. We'd put razor wire around the freeboard on the hull of the vessel, we would put the fire hoses out, we would make sure all the doors were locked down, and essentially we'd be putting a plan in place that if the worst case happened and pirates boarded our vessel, people knew what their roles was and what to do. And I guess it was just for that, having worked in hostile environments most of my life, you do need a calm head in a crisis scenario that's going to take control and say, okay, bullets are flying, rockets are flying, but we need to get a grip of this situation quite quickly. And I guess that was our role in many respects. And unfortunately, as we say in the military, no plan survives first contact, and we were illegally boarded by pirates. We were supposed to discharge the cargo. It's been 24 hours, and then what was hours became days. And as you know, in international logistics and shipping, there are always delays somewhere along the line. And our berth wasn't available for discharge. So we're literally sat outside the port of Mogadishu, a sitting duck, a target waiting to be hit, I guess. And I get a phone call or a radio call one morning from my colleague. He's on the bridge of the vessel, so the command station. And I was lying in my cabin. And he said, Jordan, you need to get up to the bridge very quickly. We've got armed pirates trying to board the vessel. And by the time I'd got up to the bridge, that was exactly what we saw. We saw armed men with AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, boarding the vessel. And that was where we then had to activate our contingency plan. And the drill, as we trained our crew in, was that when pirates have boarded the vessel illegally, we go to what's called a citadel, or a safe room, or a panic room for a better word. And what we do is we account for everybody in there, and we make sure everybody's safe, everybody's secure, and we sort of, I guess, barricade ourselves in and make sure nobody can breach our defences. And we've set in, what we do as maritime security professionals, we try and implement a layered defence system, and what we're trying to do is buy us time. So if we do call a rescue from the coalition forces in the region, or the Coast Guard, or whoever's going to come to our support, we've bought enough time that we've slowed the pirates down enough for the good guys to come and rescue us. So we got to the citadel, all was going to plan. We secured ourselves in because, of course, we didn't have any arms, and if we'd had arms, we'd maybe been able to neutralise the situation in a very different way. But we're in the citadel. I've accounted for everybody with the captain. We literally line all the crew up, mixed nationalities, and we check everybody's there. And the reason we do that is because if everybody isn't in there, we then end up in a hostage situation where the pirates have one of our crew members, and if they've got one of us, essentially they've got all of us, because, as I say, it's a hostage situation. They put a gun to someone's head, as we see in the movies, and they say, you're all coming out now, or else he's getting the bad news. So we made sure everyone was accounted for. We're in the citadel, and as you can imagine at this time, we've disabled the engines, the lights are off, it's very hot and humid in an engine room. We're going right into the depths of the vessel here, in the steering gear room in fact. And people are panicking. People think they're not going to see their families. They know what's going on. They know that armed criminals, pirates are on board. And as you can imagine, this is a very stressful situation for the young crew member, or for any crew member, including ourselves. And we're on board the vessel, and the next course of action for me is, when I've counted for everybody with the captain, is to then call in a rescue. So we had a satellite phone that was wired into the Citadel that we tested every day throughout the journey as part of our daily routine. Always test your communications. But unfortunately, on this scenario, in this situation, the satellite phone wasn't working. We were drifting in a black spot in the ocean. And a bit like having your mobile phone, sometimes you don't get a signal depending on where you are in the world. And we had that exact same scenario on the vessel. And that created a lot of tension, because now, our plan B was to go to the Citadel. We didn't have a plan C, D and E. So now we needed another plan, because we didn't have any communications, and we're fully aware that the pirates are making progress at this point and making their way to try and find us and identify us and take control of the vessel and crew. So people are getting very stressed, people are getting very agitated. And the captain says to me, "Okay, Jordan, what do we do next?" And to be completely honest, I didn't have an idea. Whether it was lack of knowledge, experience, I didn't know what we were going to do next, because for me the plan B was we go to the Citadel and we call in a rescue. But the problem is when you've got no communications to call in a rescue, guess what? Nobody's coming to rescue you. So I had to speak to the captain quite aggressively, because what I asked him to do next was something that went against all the rules, against all the standard operating procedures, against all the protocol that we'd been taught and learned. And I wanted to leave the Citadel. So I was basically asking the captain's permission to leave the Citadel, which in effect would, and he was right in what he was saying to me, because I was going to compromise their lives, because if the pirates got me, we have that hostage situation that I referred to earlier. But the problem is what else could we do? So I, after a heated debate with the captain, and not only the captain, but with my own team members who were also former British military, one of them was also not happy for me to leave the Citadel, because he also knew that I'd be compromising his life if I was caught. But I think, this is a unique situation, and I always say that standard operating procedures, whether it's in business in a law firm or whether it's in the Citadel off the coast of Somalia, they're designed for standard scenarios, for routine that we do day in, day out. This wasn't a standard procedure, so we couldn't apply standard methods to a non-standard procedure. And I think sometimes there are times in life that you have to break the rules, and if we look at pioneers, if we look at innovators, entrepreneurs, they're all people that have break the rules in order to succeed at some point, I find. And when I look back in hindsight, me leaving the Citadel with that satellite phone was something that I needed to do in order to secure the safety of the crew and the vessel and the cargo. So I took the satellite phone. I managed to find a different part of the vessel that had a signal. I essentially climbed up the funnel of the ship. You can imagine a ship's a big piece of metal, so there was a lot of signal blockage. I climbed up to an external part of the ship through the funnel. There was an emergency hatch on the back of the funnel, and I was able to call in a rescue from the military forces in the region. And we all went home for happily ever after, fortunately, and it became headline news. But yeah, it was an incredible experience. That was one of the sort of main features of my maritime security, anti-piracy career. But there was occasions where we had shootouts, we exchanged rounds with the pirates, but as I said earlier, more often than not, if you fire some warning shots, the pirates would move away, because you've got to remember, they're bobbing around on a little skiff. These are typically quite young, they're poorly trained, they've got poor equipment, whereas the opposite side, we're on a very high platform on perhaps a container ship. We've got speed to our advantage. We've got a high freeboard. We've got ex-British military, some of the best trained forces in the world. We've got the best equipment in the world. We've got body armor, night vision, binoculars. The odds were always stacked in the security team's favour. The question was did the ship have a security team on? And did they implement best management practices? Because a lot of the vessels that were hijacked, and a lot of the vessels that insurers and lawyers would look at after hijack, was what measures did they have in place? Right. Were they implementing razor wire? Did they have a contingency plan? Did they register with the UK maritime trade operations in Dubai? And there was that lack of complacency. No different than being on the battlefield, being in the ocean. If you become complacent, that can become your worst enemy, whether you're a soldier or a seafarer.
So Jordan, how does all of this experience acquired from that period and those sorts of events lend itself to the sort of challenges that we're seeing today in terms of state-sponsored activity or piracy. And in this context, I'm sort of thinking about what we're seeing going on at the moment in places like the Straits of Hormuz. Does any of what we've learned from the experience that you've described lend itself in these situations?
Yeah, I think so. I think, firstly, it's important to. It's a very different set of circumstances, as you rightly say. We're dealing with a sovereign state now, which is a very different perspective and context. I think, can we take the lessons and some of the lessons that we've learned over the last decade? Absolutely, because it comes down to conducting a continuous risk assessment, and certainly, I think, based on piracy, based on emerging threats, most ship owners, most company security officers, ship security officers, they're very well versed now in assessing risks, whether that's risk assessment or threat assessment. And with the Straits of Hormuz, we look at the sort of what I call the threat triangle. We look at the intent, the capability, and the opportunity. And what we can do from a ship owner's perspective is we can never influence the intent, because if the intent is there to do something or do harm to us, well, that's going to happen. If the capability is there in terms of the weapons they're using, in terms of the tactics they're using, again, that will happen. But what we can do in terms of the opportunity and that third sort of piece of the triangle is we can reduce the opportunity for the bad guys or the people trying to do us harm. And I think that comes down to implementing the excellent guidelines that have been developed by industry, people like BIMCO, OCIMF, ICS, the International Chamber of Shipping. Lots of excellent guidelines have been developed through the lessons learned over the last 10 years. And what we've done throughout the high-risk area over the last decade is we've had a voluntary reporting system, which means we're continuously communicating with naval forces, with regional authorities to let them know where we are at all times. But also vigilance. We can only ever do something about a security situation if we know about it, which is why I'm continuously encouraging seafarers, captains, bridge officers to be on the lookout all the time, and no more so when you're in the Straits of Hormuz. We've got British vessels in the region at the moment who are supporting through escorts, who are providing a response to British flagships, but they can only support you and provide a response if they know that something's not right, which is why, again, you need to be registering your vessel that's moving through that area with UKMTO, based out of Dubai, the Royal Navy's regional hub.
Yeah.
And that's the same system that we've been using for the last decade in the Indian Ocean for piracy. Again, continuous communication, monitoring VHF channel 16 on the radio. Again, because people can only help you and support you if they know that something's there. And one of the challenges is, it doesn't take long for a pirate or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to board your vessel very quickly, whether that's from a rib or from a helicopter. So we only have a small window of opportunity to report something going wrong if we are going to report to the Navy. So vigilance is absolutely critical.
So you mentioned continuous communication as kind of one of the tactics that we see being deployed as a risk mitigant in these sorts of hotspots and in general. Obviously, by definition, I'm imagining that that's going to involve technology, which brings me on to the theme of cybersecurity at sea. I know that this is something that you know quite a bit about, because I know that you launched the Be Cyber Aware at Sea campaign a few years ago. Tell us a little bit more about that campaign and the sorts of risks that it's designed to address.
Yeah, I think we're in a world now where digitisation we're very much immersed in, and the maritime sector and the offshore sector, it relies on technology now, whether we like it or not, and it's only going to grow and evolve. And I think one of the big factors in that is that the more connectivity we have, which allows us for more efficient operations, we just have to not forget that we expose ourselves to more vulnerabilities. And the Be Cyber Aware at Sea campaign was a campaign that I set up about 4 years ago now, and I spent 2 years doing a master's degree in maritime security, and my thesis studies were Cybersecurity, the unknown threat at sea. And I wanted to basically understand what major ship owners, oil and gas majors understood about cybersecurity, and most importantly, what were they doing to mitigate the risk in this growing, evolving era of digitization and big data? So it's very much focused on the human factor. My research highlighted that 80% of cybersecurity threats risk can be reduced by training our people and making them more aware. Because I think, when I go on vessels these days, there's that much technology. And the problem is we spend hundreds of millions on technology, but we're not spending hundreds of millions on training our people how to use this technology. And you can have the best cyber defense in the world, but if someone's going to plug a USB into the side of that ECDIS, the radar, whatever it might be, again, you're leaving yourself open to a minefield of criminality. And we see it every day. And, social media is another one. Most of the vessels these days, crew are online. What are they doing online? Who are they speaking to? Because just because you've got your vessel sorted as a ship owner, the weakest link in that chain could be that young seafarer that's just joined your ship.
How is a cyber attack manifesting itself for vessels or for the shipping industry?
Well, I think it comes in all forms, shapes and sizes. We had the well-publicised Maersk incident, and many people will tell me it wasn't an incident directly targeting Maersk, which is correct. But if you speak to the chief financial officer at Maersk, he doesn't care whether it was targeting him or not. It cares that it's affected his bottom line, and I think that needs to be the approach. You will become a victim of cybersecurity at some point if you don't act now. That's a very clear message, and one that is important to say. For me, it's not a case of if you're going to get attacked. It's a case of when. These attacks are happening all the time. I think it's only becoming more prominent in the news now, is because the effects are becoming more catastrophic as we move further into this digital era.
Are you advising any ship owners, or are you seeing much by way of kind of changing of, say, reflagging vessels for these sorts of issues and for these sorts of risks?
Me personally, not so much on cyber, but certainly on other security risks.
Yeah.
I think the Straits of Hormuz is an interesting point, and we've had several inquiries recently about ship owners considering reflagging from the British flag or the Red Ensign Group to different flags around the world, because they see that they might be targeted in the Straits of Hormuz.
Right.
But to balance that out and counter argument that is that the Royal Navy are the only ones in the area protecting British vessels, so hopefully that should give them some assurance. But certainly people are monitoring the risks. Ship owners are looking, because it's a critical part of their business, and when you're dealing with 1/5 of the world's oil transit in that area every day, that's a huge impact.
So as a law firm, Reed Smith faces this industry from a number of different perspectives, not just from the ship owner perspective, but from the cargo perspective, from the oil majors perspective, even from the perspective of financial institutions that finance trade or finance transportation. So how would you kind of sum up the situation in terms of physical risk, whether it's piracy or other maritime risk for the industry as a whole at this time?
I think as we move into the digital era of shipping and offshore operations, that creates a lot of opportunities, but it should be not dismissed that there are still huge security challenges out there, and I don't just mean in the areas that we've talked about today, in the Gulf of Aden, Indian Ocean, or the Straits of Hormuz. If we look to places like Latin America, we see the fallout of the crisis in Venezuela. We've seen a lot of illicit maritime activity in places like Guyana, in Trinidad, on the coastal states there. So maritime challenges are all around the world. Even in the English Channel, I was doing some work there just last week, and we're seeing migrants, refugees trying to make their way across to mainland, which is creating challenges for the Coast Guard, the Department for Transport in the UK. Maritime threats and challenges are all around us, and when we look at piracy alone, we have to remember that that's accounting for less than 1% of maritime security incidents. Although it's the sexy subject, so to speak, it's only a drop in the ocean where maritime security is concerned. I think for people like yourselves, for lawyers, insurers, business executives, the markets where freight is concerned continue to consolidate, it seems, is what I understand. Oil and gas transportation around the world is a very competitive market, and where there is lucrative targets, there will always be criminals that are evolving, and threats will evolve and continue to evolve. Cyber is a great example of that. But what I would probably say to finish is that where security and safety is concerned at sea, is fortune will always favour the prepared.
Jordan, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and your experience with us today. If you want to hear more from Jordan, he is, of course, as I've mentioned, the author of the autobiographical #1 best-selling book called Citadel, and it chronicles his experiences in almost all of the major piracy events of the last decade or so. Jordan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.